If there's one chapter that really defines how we're built, it's got to be the embryology of the nervous system.
Oh, absolutely.
So today, we are taking on the dense, sometimes intimidating text of Gray's Anatomy, Chapter 14. Our mission is to visually construct the entire central and peripheral nervous system, starting from just a flat sheet of cells. No diagrams needed.
It really is the ultimate engineering project, and what's so remarkable is that this massive, complex network, and this includes all of our specialized sensory organs, it doesn't come from a huge variety of tissues.
Right.
It all arises from 3 incredibly specific cell populations in the early embryo. We call them collectively the neural ectoderm.
Okay, so let's unpack those 3 original sources.
Yeah.
If the nervous system is, a vast corporation, what are the 3 original hiring pools?
Yeah.
And what divisions do they end up managing?
Well, the first, and maybe the most straightforward, is the neural plate. This is the core structure.
The headquarters.
Exactly. It folds up, forms the central command unit, and gives rise to the entire central nervous system. So the brain and spinal cord, plus the somatic motor nerves and the preganglionic parts of the autonomic system.
Got it. So anything centrally processed, anything involving direct motor control that's coming from the plate. What about the communication network that has to stretch across the whole body?
That's source number 2, the neural crest cells. These cells are the travelers. They start right at the perimeter, the very edges of that neural plate.
Okay.
And crucially, they don't just stay put. They undergo what's called an epithelial to mesenchymal transition. They basically transform into migratory cells before the plate even fuses into a tube.
So they literally get they get their moving orders before the main structure is even fully built.
Precisely. And their destination list is, well, it's vast. They form the bulk of the peripheral nervous system. We're talking every somatic sensory nerve, almost all the peripheral ganglia, postganglionic, autonomic nerves, and even non-neuronal cells like melanocytes, your pigment cells, and the chromaffin cells in the adrenal glands.
Wow. So if you feel a mosquito bite on your arm or your stress response kicks in, you are thanking a neural crest derivative.
You are.
So what's the third, that highly specialized source?
The third source is the ectodermal placodes. Now, these are specific focal thickenings of ectoderm you only find around the embryonic head.
Just in the head?
Just in the head. They specialize in high-definition sensory input. They contribute cells to things like the olfactory epithelia, the critical structures of the inner ear, and they even contribute non-neuronally to the lens of the eye.
That's a perfect setup.
Yeah.
We have our raw materials. So let's talk about the initial construction phase, neurulation. How does that flat plate turn into a protective tube?
Neurulation is this beautiful mechanical process. Mostly it's primary neurulation, and it happens fast between stages 9 and 12. The cells in the plate, they first elongate, and then the whole structure just reshapes. It forms a groove, and then the edges fold up and meet in the middle to fuse.
When I visualize this, I picture a zipper starting in the middle and then running towards the head and the tail at the same time. Is that the right idea?
That zipper analogy is really helpful, but the closure is a little more nuanced. There's an initial site alpha, that starts in the hindbrain region and zips both ways, just like you said.
Okay.
But then a second site beta, forms up in the forebrain region and zips caudally to meet that first zipper line. It's a highly coordinated multi-site closure.
And the timing of this zippering, I imagine, defines some major milestones for the embryo.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
The rostral neuropore, that's the head opening, it has to close by stage 11. The caudal neuropore, the tail end, closes a bit later at stage 12, around 30 to 32 days. If either of those fails to seal, the consequences are critical.
Right. And you mentioned how it elongates and folds.
Yeah.
The cellular mechanism behind that is something called convergent extension. Can you make that visual for us?
Okay, so think of it less like folding a piece of paper and more like sculpting clay. The individual cells, they dramatically narrow their top surfaces. As they get skinny, they push against their neighbors, forcing the whole tissue to converge towards the midline.
So it can't go wide.
It can't go wide, so it's forced to elongate from head to tail. That's the extension part. It's this massive global movement driven by microscopic changes in cell shape.
That explains the lengthening.
Yeah.
And the folding itself uses specific hinge points, doesn't it, to get the right shape?
Correct. Along the midline, cells form a wedge shape, creating the main folding anchor. That's the median hinge point, which becomes the floor plate. In other areas, especially in the brainstem, we get dorsolateral hinge points too, which gives the tube a more complex rhombic shape.
That covers the primary method. But the very, very end of the tail is built differently, isn't it?
It is. That's secondary neurulation. This is how the neural tube below the future S2 vertebra forms, and it does it without a neural plate. Instead, you get mesenchymal cells in what's called the caudal eminence. They clump together, become epithelial, and form a solid rod.
A solid rod. So how does it get a hollow center?
It then hollows out through a process called cavitation to form that final lumen. It's a completely different strategy.
And if this whole fusion process, primary or secondary, fails, that's where we see the really devastating clinical issues.
We do. These are the neural tube defects. If the entire tube fails to close, it's craniohexaschisis totalis. If it's a rostral failure, you get anencephaly. A local failure in the spine is spina bifida.
And it's worth noting, right, that these defects often happen right around that junction where primary and secondary neurulation meet.
That transition point seems to be inherently vulnerable. It suggests some really sensitive molecular signaling has to happen right at that boundary.
Okay, so now the blueprint gets much more complex. The head end of that simple tube starts to expand and fold. What are the first three big swellings we see?
Those are the three primary brain vesicles. The prosencephalon or forebrain, the mesencephalon, the midbrain, and the rhombencephalon, the hindbrain.
And the rhombencephalon is especially important early on.
It is because it very quickly segments into 8 distinct units called rhombomeres. And these aren't just bulges, they're functional signaling compartments that dictate exactly where cranial motor nuclei will form and how neural crest cells are going to migrate.
And to fit all this expansion in, the tube has to bend. It has to fold on itself. What are the key flexures?
The first is the sharp mesencephalic flexure, a ventral bend that sort of tucks the forebrain around the notochord. Then you have the cervical flexure, where the hindbrain meets the spinal cord.
And there's a third one that dramatically reshapes the fourth ventricle.
That's the pontine flexure. It's another ventral bend, but this one happens within the rhombencephalon. Imagine pulling taffy's fold stretches the roof plate of the hindbrain so thin that it's just a single layer of cells left. That's the telecordia. And that stretching is what gives the fourth ventricle its wide diamond shape.
So after all this segmentation and folding, where do these vesicles end up? What do they become?
The prosencephalon splits into the telencephalon, which just explodes in size to become the cerebral hemispheres, and the diencephalon, which forms the thalamus and hypothalamus. The mesencephalon stays as the midbrain, and the rhombencephalon gives the myelencephalon, the medulla, and the metencephalon, which becomes the pons and cerebellum.
Let's dive into the cellular cross-section now, because this is key to how it's all organized functionally. The patterning from top to bottom, or dorsoventral, is controlled by the tissue right underneath the tube.
That's the notochord. It's in close contact ventrally, and it induces this special strip of cells called the floor plate. And that ventral signal sets up the whole functional divide.
Okay, how so?
The floor plate and notochord complex, they induce the basal plate ventrally. That's the home of all the motor columns. Conversely, all the sensory neurons and interneurons develop dorsally in the alar plate.
So just its location, ventral or dorsal, directly determines if a neuron is motor or sensory. And there's a physical line dividing them, right?
Yes, the sulcus limitans. It's a visible groove in the lateral wall of the tube that functionally separates the motor basal plate from the sensory alar plate. It's a crucial boundary all the way up through the brainstem.
Now, if we look at the wall of the tube itself, from the inside out, there are 3 zones that tell the whole story of cell life and migration.
Right. Deepest, right against the lumen, is the ventricular zone. This is where the progenitor cells live and divide, and they do it through something called interkinetic nuclear migration.
That sounds complicated.
It's a great visual. Imagine a factory worker. The nucleus moves down to the basal surface to synthesize its DNA, then it races back up toward the lumen, the apical surface, to actually perform mitosis. It's a mandatory up and down traffic pattern for every single division.
What a great way to picture it. So all the action is right next to the lumen. What happens after they divide?
The daughter cells migrate outwards. They form the middle layer, the mantle zone. This is the future gray matter where the actual neuronal cell bodies will live. And then the most superficial layer is the marginal zone, which becomes the white matter, full of all the axons.
Let's go back to those travelers, the neural crest cells. Their migration in the trunk isn't random at all, is it?
Not at all. It's highly patterned by the developing somites. Neural crest cells are only allowed to pass through the front half, the rostral, sclerotomal half of each somite.
Wait, so the body literally has molecular roadblocks built into the back half of the segment just to force the cells through the front half?
It does. The caudal half contains inhibitory molecules that actively repel them. It's incredibly sophisticated, and it's vital. This segmented migration is precisely why your dorsal root ganglia form at these regular, predictable intervals.
And up in the head, the cranial neural crest cells are patterned by those rhombomeres we mentioned.
Correct. So cells from rhombomeres 1 and 2, for example, migrate specifically into the first pharyngeal arch to build the face and jaws. Even more globally, vagal and sacral neural crest cells migrate all the way down to colonize the entire developing gut. They establish the enteric nervous system.
Our second brain.
Exactly, and the importance of that is really highlighted when it goes wrong.
Hirschsprung's disease.
Yes. If those vagal and sacral crest cells fail to properly reach the distal colon, the child develops Hirschsprung's disease. That segment of gut lacks the necessary ganglia, so it can't function. It's just amazing to think a defect in cells that migrated from the neck and tail weeks earlier can cause such a profound GI issue.
Moving back up rostrally, let's talk about the mesencephalon and the cerebellum. Its development is totally unique, built from two separate cell sources at the same time.
That's its signature. It all starts at the rhombic lip. First, you have cells from the deep ventricular zone. They form the large output neurons, the Purkinje cells, and the deep nuclei. That's an inside-out construction.
And the second source comes from the surface.
Right. Cells from that same rhombic lip migrate over the surface to form the external germinative layer, or EGL. This acts like a second factory. Its progeny then migrate inward, past the Purkinje cells to become the tiny granule cells. That's the classic outside-in migration.
So you have this beautiful interweaving of inside out and outside in.
Precisely.
Now for the telencephalon, the cerebral hemispheres, they start as two big balloons basically, and their cavities become the lateral ventricles. But before the cortex forms, the deep nuclei develop.
The basal nuclei form first. You get these thickenings, the ganglionic eminences, in the floor and walls of the hemisphere, and these eventually become the corpus striatum, the caudate, and lentiform nuclei.
And the massive connection between the two hemispheres, the corpus callosum, where does that cross?
It passes through the lamina terminalis, which is this thin membrane at the very front of the developing third ventricle. That's the critical crossing point.
So focusing on the cortex itself, let's talk about that incredible inside-out pattern. How does that work?
It's the hallmark of our cortex. Neurons are born deep in the ventricular and subventricular zones. Then they have to migrate radially, climbing along these radial glial cells toward the surface.
And here's the key part.
Here's the key. The earliest neurons only form the deepest layers. Later generated neurons have to physically migrate past those established layers to take up the most superficial positions. It's like building a brick wall from the bottom up, but every new layer of bricks has to climb over the ones already there.
And during this process, there's a vital but temporary communication hub that forms.
That's the subplate zone. It's a transient, absolutely crucial layer that's biggest around postmenstrual week 25. It helps integrate early connections and establish the initial circuitry. But because it's temporary, it's incredibly vulnerable to damage in preterm infants.
Okay, we've built the structure. Now let's get to the danger zone. Vascularization. The developing brain has this dual circulation model.
It does. Vessels sprout in, that's angiogenesis, and they form a network on the surface. This network then feeds two totally distinct arterial systems inside the hemisphere.
And how are those two systems oriented?
You have the ventriculopetal arteries. They supply the cortex and white matter, and they flow inwards towards the ventricle. Then you have the ventriculofugal arteries, which supply the deepest areas, the basal nuclei and the germinal matrix, and they run outwards, away from the ventricle.
And the critical detail here is that they don't really connect. There's no effective overlap.
Precisely. That separation is the whole problem. The germinal matrix capillary bed is inherently fragile. It lacks smooth muscle, it lacks collagen, and it's supplied only by those deep ventriculofugal arteries.
So what does this all mean for a baby born prematurely? The area where these two circulations meet, or fail to meet, is a classic watershed area.
And that watershed area is exquisitely sensitive to any swing in blood pressure, which is common in preemies. When the supply gets disrupted, that area suffers from ischemia. It's starved of oxygen.
Which leads directly to the two major types of brain injury we see.
Exactly. First, because those capillaries in the germinal matrix are so wet, pressure swings can cause them to burst. That's a GMH-IVH, a germinal matrix hemorrhage, bleeding into that deep zone.
And the second.
Second, if the white matter surrounding that zone suffers damage from ischemia in that watershed region, you get PVL periventricular leukomalacia, and damage to that developing white matter circuitry has profound lifelong consequences.
Lastly, we should just touch on myelination, which is the ultimate marker of maturity.
Myelination, the sheathing of axons, happens in a very predictable sequence. The PNS gets myelinated before the CMS, motor roots before sensory roots, and in the CNS, it generally goes from caudal to rostral. The presence of certain newborn reflexes, like the Babinski sign, is a direct reflection of which inhibitory pathways have not yet completed their myelination.
What an incredible journey. We started with 3 simple cell populations and tracked them through folding, through this incredibly precise migration like the cells only passing through the front half of a somite, and these complex layering patterns in the cortex and cerebellum. And the ultimate clinical vulnerability of the premature brain is rooted in this immature dual circulation system.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it's so important to remember that development doesn't just stop at birth. The final maturation of the nervous system, things like eliminating that subplate zone and finishing up myelination, that continues well into adulthood.
A lifelong process.
It suggests a remarkable lifelong capacity for micro-remodeling and plasticity that just far outlasts this initial embryonic phase we've been talking about.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the anatomical foundations of the nervous system. We hope this makes Chapter 14 of Gray's Anatomy a lot more accessible.